right now I'm in the process of writing a book about our experiences on the Shackleton project, and it's basically going to get printed and sent out to all the world's billionaires. And if one of them reads it and says, why not? Then we change the world. So it's like any other situation, I would have said that's a crackpot idea. But I've spent enough time and I know how to take crazy ass ideas and turn them into reality.
Off-Gassing, a scuba podcast with host Nick Hogel. Explorer, pioneer, innovator, a few words used to describe my next guest. In this week's interview, I speak with Bill Stone. Bill has been pushing boundaries as far back as he could remember. From the deepest caves to space exploration, no frontier is off limits. I get a chance to speak with Bill about the early days of technical diving, rebreathers, past explorations, future projects, arguments over cheese, and changing the world. I hope you enjoy. Bill, how are you doing today?
Well, I'm doing about as good as I can expect, juggling a 12 to 14 hour day, 7 day a week schedule.
Is this with Stone Aerospace?
Yeah, we just got back about a month ago from a 2-month expedition, and when you do that, it's you got to plunge back into the business side of things and thank your acting CEO for allowing you to do these crazy bits of field work. But yeah, we've got a lot of pretty exciting space projects going on right now, and everybody is working long hours.
Okay. And so you're based in Austin, Texas, Del Valley?
That's right. Yeah, we're just a suburb of Austin, ever expanding town.
Yeah. No, so a little bit of my history. So right now I'm currently in Malaysia, but I actually just moved from Austin, Texas last August. So I was living in Leander, but I have a house in Round Rock. So I know the Austin area pretty well.
Well, those of us who were here long before the big expansion, thank you for making the town less populous. We got too many Californians moving here.
Well, yeah, and that was actually going to be one of my questions for you. Is obviously you've kind of answered that. Was how you've been in Austin for quite a while. I saw that you went to college there in the 70s.
Yeah, I got my PhD at UT Austin, and moved away for a while, worked at a national lab for 24 years, and then moved back to found the company here.
Oh, okay. So do you have a favorite barbecue spot over there?
If we have guests coming in, we always take them out to the Salt Lake, the original one, southwest of town. It's got that feel of being on a ranch and, kind of down home, old school Texas, not the high tech stuff.
Yeah. No, I do miss it. There are certain things. I mean, we don't get very good. We have really good food here in Malaysia, but definitely not, Texas barbecue or anything like that. There's one place that's not too bad, but I definitely, oddly enough, I find myself missing Rudy's from time to time just because I think it's just kind of a good go-to barbecue place.
Rudy's is not bad. The county line, those are the big three.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I will be honest with you. I, just reading through your resume and through the just countless pages of things that you've done in your lifetime, I really don't know where to begin. And obviously we were limited time. So I'm picking my brain on how to really start the interview. And I wanted to throw out an icebreaker. I was able to interview Richard Pyle about a week ago, and I was like, hey, can you give me any questions I could ask him that might be kind of like a good icebreaker? And he was telling me, he's like, oh, ask him about the Rolling Stones concert in Hawaii.
Well, I can tell you 2 short stories about that. The Rolling Stones concert was kind of the wrap up to a week that we were out there with Henry Kendall. The reason I remember that was because Rich had gotten these seats up in the upper stadium deck, and the band, of course, it was like 1998 or something like that. They were still quite athletic and, putting on a fantastic show. And the audience was responding by jumping up and down in sync. And as they were doing that, I could feel the structures actually deforming in sync and going into resonance. And nobody else seemed to notice this. The reason I did is because I was on the Federal Structural Failure Investigation team, and I had seen the results of what happens when people drive a structure to resonance. And so in my mind, I was immediately picturing that I was going to be the one who was in the disaster scene, not the one who was investigating it. Luckily, it didn't come down, so we had a good time that night. But the thing that I think he was alluding to was something that really hit home to me in a way that I hadn't really thought about it only once before. And I'll come back to that one. And we had decided to do a rebreather dive, Cislunar Mark V, and he took us out off Diamond Head, and we drove a Zodiac boat out there and parked it, and there was maybe 80 to 100 foot depth. At that point, we dropped down. There was a little bit of coral and some fish and things like that. And he said, this is not the interesting part. We're going to go over here. And just one minor addition to tell you is that we were diving Heliox 9010 in the rigs and had dropped off oxygen for decompression and things like that. So we started going down this sand slope, not very descriptive, nothing particularly interesting. The slope just kept going and going. We really didn't pay any attention. I was watching Rich and trying to figure out where the heck he was going to take us. Well, pretty soon we're at this giant head wall, and he writes down on a slate, he says, lobsters. And so we go over, and we're at the base of this head wall, and we are just having a grand old time. If you've ever done rebreather diving, they're basically silent, and so you can do things like talk through the mouthpiece and stuff like that. And so he was giving us this little guided tour through the mouthpiece, and we saw this gigantic lobster tucked away in this hole, and I said, dinner? And he goes, no. And I said, why? And he said, if you bring it back, it will squeal, and the sharks will detect that and come after us. And I said, okay, let's forget that. Well, it was only about this time that he pointed to his watch and tapped on it. We'd been down for an hour and a half, maybe an hour and 45 minutes at that point. It was only then that I actually bothered to look at the depth gauge, and we were at 92 meters. So we're sitting there going, oh, yeah, right. We got a little decompression coming up. And so up we go, back up the slope, and we're just hanging out there at 30 meters depth, just doing hours of decoing. And off way in the distance, I hear this kind of funny sound. And Rich comes over and he writes on his slate, he says, tourist submarines, want to see them? And I said, sure. I said, how far away? He goes, about a mile. And I said, oh, yeah, right, okay. So we start swimming, and we swim a mile over to this little submarine canyon where the tourist things are coming through, and we're sitting on the edge of the canyon. Okay, we just blew negative, and we're all sitting there like a bunch of, peas on a pod there, waving, at the tourists coming by in the tourist subs. And then Rich points to his watch again and says, by the time we get back, we'll be done with deco. So we get back, we swim back over another mile back to the Zodiac, grab a little oxygen, and we surface. And I had the weirdest damn sensation. It was like, oh, this is a different world up here. We were just living down there, and the dive was 7 hours and 20 minutes long, and we never really thought about the surface. And that was when it hit me, just how powerful closed circuit systems were underwater. I had one other experience like this, but it wasn't as compact and instantly obvious, and that was when we had that National Geographic project down to Huautla, where we were diving the sump. It was the basis for that book, Beyond the Deep. What really never came out of that book was the fact that we did something like 28 dives on that project, and we never fired a compressor, we never used a gas booster, and when I added up all of the pressure tank usages that we had done down there, the equivalent gas was one 80 cubic foot bottle of Heliox 8614 and 50 cubic foot of oxygen for 28 dives. A lot of those were at 28, 30 meters depth for sometimes 2.5 hours. All of that for just that tiny little bit of gas, you know. So the revelation was really starting to hit home. I'd spent so many years, you know, trying to design this crap and just get underwater and make it reliable enough so that you weren't reaching for your bailout bottle every other minute. But that was kind of like, you know, just the crack of the door letting us know what was ahead. And of course, you know, they're depth independent devices, and so it's easy to start thinking. And Rich Powell, you know, did this, you know, where suddenly they were doing 140, 150, 180 meter dives to go find fish, and that was just, you know, he was just one manifestation of that new door that had been opened. The fact that it had limitations was accentuated when Shek Exley died in Cenote Zacatón back in 1994. Same year, unfortunately, that we were realizing that it was such a powerful tool. You know, Shek was doing all that on open circuit, even though he was doing it with mixed gas, but they ran into the problem of HPNS. And so from that point forward, there was this question of, all right, you know, yeah, you can go fairly deep. How deep can you really go? And it turns out, you know, 200, 220 meters, you're safe on helium and oxygen. And beyond that, if you use what has, you know, up until very recently, like as of February, been, you know, the standard of either, you know, heliox with a tad of nitrogen thrown in to dampen the HPNS response. You know, and then of course there was the dive in February by Harry Harris and Craig Challen, you know, the first hydrogen. It wasn't really the first hydrogen dive, it had been done before, but nobody had really done it for cave diving in that way. So, you know, there's another door potentially opening. Right now we have a data point of 1. And so everybody is scratching their heads thinking, all right, what's the next move? We were very much in the same position back in 1985 when Rob Parker and I started using helium in training for the Wookiee Hole project in the summer of 1985. Back then, everybody was telling us you're going to die on helium because everybody knew that the Navy recommended 50-foot oxygen deco, and that's where people died from convulsions. And that was the myth, you know, you just didn't use helium. Well, that cracked open in 85. By 87, we had the Blue Holes expedition with Rob Palmer, and then the first Wakulla project just, you know, kind of blew the barn doors off. And at that point, that was really the start of the technical diving revolution.
Okay, no, that's an amazing story. I guess I'll bring it back just a little bit. So how long have you been friends with Richard? I mean, I know you've known him for quite some time, but how did you two end up meeting?
So we had just finished that first Wakulla project, and before we had even published the book on it, Rich had heard about us and what we were doing with rebreathers. It was only an experiment at Wakulla. You know, Shek Exley and Wes Giles and all those guys were still using open circuit. I mean, we blew through a hideous amount of helium back then, like 4 tractor trailers worth of K bottles. You know, thank God Air Products was a sponsor. I wouldn't even want to think about what the price tag on that was today. But we did this 24-hour dive with that rebreather, and Pyle heard about it through the grapevine, and he wrote me this letter. I don't know how old he was, but he wasn't very old. He might have been like 19 or something like that. And he said, well, you know, if you're getting to the stage where you need somebody to help, you know, test your rebreather in different environments, I'd like to use it for fish hunting. If you've talked to Rich, you know his story about how terribly bent he got. Trying to impress his PhD advisor. And so he was very curious about what was going on. And so that, you know, we started this letter exchange for a couple of years. And when the 94 Nat Geo project was done, we had 9 Mark IV rebreathers. These are the earlier cislunar versions. And he said, hey, can I come up and try it? And so he came up, and after seeing, you know, how enthusiastic I was, I said, well, why don't you just take 2 of these back to Hawaii and see what you can do with them? And so he did. And you know, that was really the beginning. And at that point, he's a talented guy, and we just pulled him on to the cislunar team, and he became one of the designers of the Mark V, and later on with the Poseidon Mark VI and the 7 units. So I've known him for quite a while now.
Yeah, he really, really nice guy. I hope to have him back onto the podcast, because we spoke a little. He was telling me about the story when he got bent. He was telling me a few other things, but obviously an hour goes by pretty quick, and same with him. He's got quite the extensive resume, so hopefully I can have him back on and you know, hear a little bit more of his story.
I'm assuming you've seen the video Helium-Induced Tourette Syndrome?
I do not think I have.
Oh, if you haven't, you're in for a treat. Just ask Rich for a video link.
Okay.
I'm not going to tell you anymore because it's worth watching.
Okay. No, that's all. I will ask him about that next time I chat with him. So to bring it back just a little bit further, so you were a caver before you got that. That was the reason you got into scuba diving, caver explorer. From my understanding from my reading, how did you get into that? Was it just a cave trip? No. Well,
yeah, in a way. So I had no interest at all in diving. In fact, in the I guess it was like Christmas of, what year? 1975 it was. I was down in northern Mexico and at a campfire at a place where kind of international cavers gathered doing work in that common area north of Ciudad Valles. There were a couple of Brits, and one of them was Martin Farr. I don't know if that name rings a bell to you. But Martin, over the course of the years, has pretty much written the Bible on the history of cave diving. If you haven't read The Darkness Beckons, there's a treat for you out there. He was a very talented, multidisciplinary guy. He was both a good vertical caver, but he was trained by the CDG, the British Cave Diving Group, and had been doing work in Wookey Hole and a couple other places over there. And if you know anything about English cave diving, it's sump diving. Okay, it's not spring diving. You drag your gear through the cave, and then you get into this tight, muddy underwater continuation of the cave, and and off you go in zero visibility. That's British cave diving. So if you wonder why Rick Stanton was called over to Thailand to go rescue kids in zero visibility sumps, that's why. Okay, Brits are quite good at their natural environment over there. So in any event, we ended up hiking up this mountain to do a deep cave over the Christmas of '75, and he started telling me about what he was doing in Wookey Hole, and as I was listening to him, the thought that was forming in the back of my head was, this man is insane, and he will be dead within years, and I will remember that I talked to him. Well, about less than a year later, I moved to Austin to go to UT, and they have a very active caving organization here. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people moved to Austin in the 70s and 80s. There was a very well-known enclave called Kirkwood Road, where I think at one time there were something like 9 houses completely occupied by expedition cavers, and they moved here not for Texas but for Mexico. That's where the action was south of the border. So I was at one of these meetings in the fall of 1976, and a guy got up in front of the group and he says, "Well, I'm going over to Century Caverns this Saturday." So this is like Wednesday night, and he said, "If anybody wants to come and help me, we're gonna do a dive through this 100-meter long tunnel and then do some mapping on the other side." And I went up to him after and I said, "What are you doing?" He says, "Oh yeah, we'll put scuba gear on and we go through this tunnel, and then we'll be it won't be more than about a 4 or 5 hour trip." And I said, "Well, I don't know how to dive." He says, "Oh, that's no problem. Just come on over to my apartment on Friday night and I'll teach you." And so Friday night comes around. This is the day before the trip, right? And he takes me out to the pool behind the apartment, and he gives me this single tank, a J valve, no pressure gauge, single regulator, and a mask, and he says, "Okay, go in the pool and do 5 laps. And he says, "Don't hold your breath." Okay, so I do 5 laps in the pool. He says, "Good." And then he goes over and he finds this big lounge chair, and he tosses it into the pool. And he goes, "Okay, now come up sideways under the chair there where you can see the hole, going under the seat." He says, "Take your scuba tank off and push it ahead of you and crawl under the chair." And I go, "Okay." And so I go ahead and I do it. And he comes back and says, "Okay, you're ready." So less than 10 hours later, we are out there at Century Caverns, and we do this 100-meter long dive. And, it's probably a 2-meter tall, 1.5-meter wide tunnel, crappy visibility. There is a line through it, fortunately. We get to the other side, we map for a couple hours, we come back. And I didn't really think anything of it. About, 3 or 4 months later, there was, at that time, the world's most well-known expedition sump diver. His name was Mike Boone out of Britain. And he had been living over in Canada for a while, and somebody that he knew as a friend in Austin, as all this little connectivity between cavers, told him that he had heard that I had been cave diving and that he was a little concerned about it. And so one Saturday morning, I'm getting ready to go back into the university, and there's a knock on the door, and I open it up, and there's this kind of oily, long-haired, black-haired, big plastic plastic rimmed glasses guy with a straggly beard, and he goes, "Are you Bill Stone?" And I go, "Yeah." He said, "We need to talk." and I back into my living room with him kind of right on me, and he comes up to me and he says, "I heard you've been cave diving." And I go, "Yeah." And he takes his finger, right, and he pounds it into my chest with every word, and he says, "Dangerous stuff, you know." and then he says, "Sit down. I'm going to tell you how to save your life." And that was it. We spent 2 hours, and by God, he went through everything I had done wrong and what the current thinking was on redundancy and how to, manage air and how to run lights and how to handle a line. This is long before they had courses in cave diving. Hell, even when I started working with Sheck Exley, it was still an apprenticeship. It wasn't an ACD or CDS course. I mean, now they've got dozens of courses that will be happy to certify you in cave diving. But back then, in the early 80s, there was only these 2 nascent ones that formed after I had started training with Sheck. So yeah, that was, and why do this? Well, after that, what happens invariably in very deep caves is eventually you get to a point where there's a little hiccup in the strata. The limestone can buckle. And if you get one that's convex, it'll hold water. But there's air-filled tunnel on the upstream side and there's air-filled tunnel on the downstream side. And anytime the elevation between where you are and where there are known springs on the mountain, which could be a long ways down, could be thousands of meters, it's going to have a continuation on the other side that has airspace. And since then, of course, I've been involved with scores of, very, very deep, long cave dives, not spring dives, but, going very long and very deep to even get to where you got to dive, and so that has kind of forced us to invent different ways of diving. Somebody came to my to the ranch out here one time, and I showed him the equipment room, and he said, "But where are the scuba tanks and the regulators and the backpacks?" And I go, "Well, there's the tanks." And he goes, "What are those?" I says, "Those are carbon, epoxy tanks that pump to 7,500 PSI." And he stops and goes, "What?" I said, "Oh yeah, that's the low-tech stuff." I said, "Over here, and there is no standard piece of kit. Anything that we might have utilized, even the Mark V's, we radically converted. And so, the whole paradigm where you see a rebreather with side mount tanks, that all came out of our shop. Dual rebreathers, all that stuff, that was all invented because we started thinking about how do we keep our asses alive when we're doing long cave dives. And even today, it turns out that cave divers, or at least people who design cave diving equipment, are way ahead of government space agencies. They don't know what it means to be hours away from a safety zone. Not only do we have decompression, but we might be traveling for 2, 3, 4 hours one way. And that's certainly the case that we were doing about 12 years later in 1999 in Wakulla, when we were doing 22-hour dives on the average in there. The distance one way was about 2 hours and 40 minutes in, 240 out, 5 hours in water decompression, and then 12 hours in a habitat through a transfer capsule. So, that the space agencies haven't caught up to that idea of how do you work at really, really remote places and do so safely. And so, anyways, there you go. So it was all part of figuring out how to keep exploring very deep caves, and that goes on. We still keep running into underwater tunnels, and it's kind of a toss-up these days. When you find one of these things, you don't instantly go, "Oh, let's bring tanks." For one thing, if you do it anything, what you're going to do is bring very lightweight small tanks and a small rebreather first, and see what you've got, because even bringing a little tank is a big price to pay, and you only get a very short amount of time to figure out what's going on with that. So even small compact rebreathers are what are used for recon today. But we try to avoid that at all costs. And right now, the main system we're working on, Cueva Cheve, we had a dramatic breakthrough in 2021. And so we really haven't had to do any diving there in over 6 years. And I still do cave diving. I do it mainly because we're doing experiments with autonomous robotic exploration, non-manned. And so we'll have support people in there either taking video or giving feedback over a comms line to mission control to tell them what the behavior is that's going on that they want to test. And so I'm still doing that kind of stuff. But as far as having to cave dive. I don't have a project right now that needs it, so it's one of those things where I just stow it on the shelf until I do. And if we know we're going to do it, well, then 6 months ahead of time, we'll go into a heavy training course that will try to emulate exactly what we're going to do. We've branched off way far away from what is the cutting edge of Florida cave diving right now. If you want that, go talk to the guys at KUR or WKPP and get their take on what the latest stuff is.
You've definitely been a part of, mentioned a lot of projects, explorations. Do you have a highlight one that kind of tops them all? Is there one that kind of just stands out? I mean, I know there's quite a few, so that's why I'm hesitant in asking, but I don't know if there's one that, that was just like, man, this was the one.
Oh, there have been a couple of incidents like that, and I've been doing this for a long time. Right now, I think I'm up to something like 87 or 88 expeditions. Again, you got to understand, I don't consider myself to be a diver. I'm just an explorer, and right now, caves are where the last real frontier is. If you say, oh, that sounds kind of dramatic, think about it for a second. You are working at the absolute limits of human endurance. I'll give you one example. Right now, the limit of exploration in Cueva Cheve requires a 25 to 30 day push one way from the surface with a support team of about 45 just to make you able to get out that far. And so, you're down there for a long, long time. I've logged over 1,000 days now from underground camps deeper than 500 meters, over half of them over 1,000 meters deep. So you're playing a different kind of game now. It's really all about living in an alien environment, trying to not get hurt, trying to make sure your teammates don't get hurt, trying to figure out how to not run out of food. Here's a real test that you're actually on a real, not a fabricated frontier. When you have a strong verbal argument with your teammate over whether he ate too much cheese, you're there. I imagine Shackleton's guys, had arguments over things like this, when they were headed for the South Pole in 1907. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of the deal. When you're that remote where there isn't going to be any rescue and you know it, that means you're there. You're on the real deal. And I would argue that there is no diving scenario, even including submarines, where you're that far. There is a possibility at some point, nobody's actually tried this yet, although we really did hit it in 1999 at Wakulla, where we saturated at 100 meters depth. We weren't going to get any more decompression. We could have stayed down as long as we wanted, and there wouldn't have been any more deco. And so things were starting to ramp up. We had switched to dual rebreathers at that point. We had 18 hours worth of range, and we were starting to edge up towards where we were going to be doing much longer bottom times than 5 hours, at depth and then coming back for deco. And then that was at the point where the big storms came in and the visibility went to zero and the project had to fold up. So, you pay your money and you take your chances when it comes to expedition. The weather is always, the ruling element. So, so that's it. To me, diving is a tool, and we've invented tools because we needed them. We didn't have anything that would go far enough or was lightweight enough or compact enough or whatever enough, deep enough, to do what we wanted to do. And, the people who are out there playing that cutting edge game frequently find themselves having to invent. You look at people like Charlie Roberson. He's now building his own rebreathers. You look at Harry Harris. They're designing their own systems. Yeah, they're using off-shelf components, but they're configuring their own stuff to do what they want to do, which is quite different from what anybody else has previously done. And that I find is an attraction to doing this stuff, is inventing things and then actually seeing them give you an edge to where you can open the door to the next phase of a project. Right now, I don't really have a need to go anywhere else. We've got the lion by the tail with Cueva Cheve. If everything goes according to plan, we'll hit 9,000 plus feet depth at a distance of probably on the order of 2 weeks one-way travel from the entrance. So being underground for as much as a month and a half or something like that to be able to be pushing the exploration front there, that's a challenge, and I like that.
So you're obviously not deterred by challenges, I'm assuming.
Oh, the thing is, my biggest problem that I have is that I can imagine a lot, perhaps more than other people, because I've run expeditions. I know what the tactical game is. And so I immediately add the pieces together. And so for quite a long time, we tried to push this idea of establishing a mining base on the south pole of the moon. If you go in and look up Shackleton Energy Company, it was not a game. At one point we had 160 people working on that project. We were exceedingly close in 2015 of getting the Sheikh of Dubai to put the initial venture capital cash, which was about $2 billion is what we needed to make that go. It's actually even more feasible today because of what SpaceX has done in terms of the initial boost. But I don't want to deviate from diving here. The point is, it's a tactical game, just like a caving expedition is a tactical game. It's equipment, it's people, it's working in dangerous environments. I happen to know a lot about space systems because that's what I've been doing for 45 years. How to design them, how to look with flight dynamics, re-entry, landing, propulsion, you name it, we do it. And so that's the kind of a project that easily I could take on if somebody wanted to simply come over and say, hey, let's do it. Here's the initial cash. You might laugh at that, but I'll give you one example here. Back in 1995, before we started the second Wakulla project, which was the one that was doing the saturation diving at 100 meters depth at Wakulla Springs, there was a conference in Florida on the future of underwater exploration. It wasn't just cave diving. There was a session where everybody said, well, what would be the future? Where can you really push this out? And a couple of people talked, and I said, okay, I got an idea. And I had heard people from the Florida Department of Natural Resources talking at one point saying, we don't know anything about these springs. The cave divers can't see anything because of the limited visibility. All they got is, a couple of meters either side of their line. We really don't know anything about them. And so I got up and I said, what? Here's what we could do. We could build a three-dimensional mapping system that you could fly through the cave, and on the fly it would build a 3D model that you could then use for hydrodynamics code to model influx of pollutants and things like that and rainwater and see how it moved through the cave, and you could determine what areas were important to protect and what weren't. Much more so quantitatively than anybody could do in the past with hand waving. A couple of people in the lab laughed and they said, yeah, Stone, that's 30 years off in the future. And I go, okay, I said my piece. And so as we're walking out to go to lunch, this guy I'd never met before comes up behind me and he puts his hand on my shoulder and he says, hey, you got a minute? I'd like to talk to you. I says, okay. So we walk out in the parking lot and I put the tailgate down on my truck and we sit there and he goes, could you do that? And I said, yeah. I said, that's the kind of thing I do at work. We were building autonomous Humvees 15 years before Uber and Google knew what an autonomous vehicle was. We were driving Humvees at 60 miles an hour, through backwoods, for the Army. And I said, yeah, I know how to do it. And he goes, well, how much would it cost? And I said, it's the instruments. That's where the money is. I says, it's probably going to be about $1.5 million to put a gadget like that together. And he shook his head and he said, but you really could do that. I said, yeah. He says, how long would it take? And I say, if we can round the people up, probably about 18 months, maybe 2 years at the very most. And he goes, but you could do it. And I said, yeah. And he stood up and he took a checkbook out and he wrote me a check for $350,000 and said, let's get going.
Wow.
Right now, I'm in the process of writing a book about our experiences on the Shackleton project, and it's basically going to get printed and sent out to all the world's billionaires. And if one of them reads it and says, why not? Then we change the world. So it's like any other situation, I would have said that's a crackpot idea. But I've spent enough time and I know how to take crazy ass ideas and turn them into reality. This is one of those things. It's out there, okay? It's a big reach, but it's within the technical grasp right now of doing it privately. And you say, oh, but the government is spending $150 billion on the Artemis program. Well, you know what? I've made a living of showing that you can do what the government does for about 1/50th of the money.
I wanted to ask, is that some of the stuff you have going on with Stone Aerospace?
Oh yeah, we've got related projects. It isn't that one. I haven't nailed the guy who has the checkbook who wants to do that one yet. But we're building pieces, of it. We're working, for example, on advanced spacesuits right now, closed cycle systems for astronauts. We are looking at lightweight means of getting back from orbit with orbital lifeboats. We are building systems to work on the idea of how do you find life off Earth. I've spent a lot of time in that area the past 23 years, so I think I can call myself a fairly knowledgeable person in that area, and I can tell you we're not going to find life on Mars, despite all the effort that's being put into that. The place you need to go is where the water is, and so where is that? It's places like Europa, Enceladus, Titan, Ganymede, Callisto. Europa has been the one of great interest. Unfortunately, there's a lot of politics going on right now within the space agency, and they have pushed that project off into the indefinite future because of the way in which certain people went about getting congressional fundings for a Europa mission, and I think it's unfortunate because that project was on target and had the highest probability for finding life off Earth, if anything. To cut to the chase, why do I know about that? Because we designed the systems to get through the ice caps, and we designed the systems to do autonomous exploration and look for life once you get below the ice cap. The first class of vehicles are called cryobots. They're nuclear powered. They've got to cut through 24,000 meters of ice at 80 Kelvin. Very cold, hard ice. You need a lot of power to get through that. Once you get through, now you're switching over to an RTG powered autonomous underwater vehicle, and that has a science payload on it that has a hierarchical detection system that starts looking first for microbial life, at very low energy levels. Of course, it's going to have a camera, and if you see a fish swing across the camera, just like in James Cameron's movies, it's game over, and everybody goes out and gets drunk. But the more likelihood is that it's a very low energy environment, and there's probably stuff like nanobacteria floating around in the ocean. Even better still if you can get down on the floor and find a hydrothermal vent. So that's what I do for breakfast and lunch.
That's quite a hefty breakfast and lunch. What's for dinner then?
Planning the next expedition.
Oh, okay. Is there a next Earth expedition going on? Any more like underground projects? Or
yeah. We got a 2.5 month project starting March 1 next year. It's returning back to Cheve. We had a breakthrough this year, and so we're going to go back and capitalize on it and see how deep we can get.
Awesome. I wanted to ask. It's called Guardian or Copus.
Sure.
Richard was telling me about it.
Yeah, I don't know. How much did he tell you?
Nothing really. He wanted you to kind of open it up.
Yeah, okay. Well, if Rich is bringing that up, then it's fair game. We hadn't really publicized it because it's his project. Basically, Rich works at very deep, very dangerous levels. And he's been safe. Okay, he's got a great safety record. But the problem is that you've only got a certain amount of time while you're down there, and what you want to do is have the diver, okay, the person who's the scientist, have the most effective time that they can. And so there's things that he does that waste a lot of time. And so he asked me at one point, he says, well, you've been doing a lot in robotics. What can you do to help me? And so we had this idea. The Guardian was the original idea. It's kind of morphed over into Copus. And the idea was to have an autonomous hovering underwater vehicle be your safety, your backup, the thing that's looking over your shoulder. Over the course of the years, we've built many generations of AI-based, autonomous underwater vehicles. And originally, these things that we took to Antarctica for NASA projects, they were big. They were multi-ton behemoths that were, they looked more like ROVs than AUVs, largely because they had a lot of scientific instruments on them to test these ideas for search for life under ice caps. But while we were going along with those projects, a lot of the people that we work with, mainly microbiologists, limnologists, glaciologists, people like that, were saying, this is really cool what this thing is doing, but what we need is something we can throw in the back seat of a helicopter. Can you do that? And so starting in 2010, we took internal money and started designing a person portable unit that could do everything these other ones were doing. Not carrying quite as many sensors in the payload, but doing a lot of the stuff that the other ones did, particularly the maneuverability, the ability to explore, the ability to return, avoid hitting obstacles, follow out simple behavioral responses, okay? And so I'll tell you where we were heading with this is that if you look at what's happening on Mars right now, like with Curiosity or Perseverance, these are amazing pieces of technology. I've touched them, or at least the backup units. They're works of technological art. They're incredibly beautiful. The problem is those projects cost in excess of $5 billion. And so when this thing finally lands on Mars intact, they don't want to do anything that's too bold. And so the idea of giving the robot autonomy is a dangerous proposition. And so the way they work it is they got a team of 50 people, mostly programmers, and they will do whatever they're going to do that day. They'll look at the data, and it takes 20 minutes each way to send the data back. And they say, okay, this is what we're going to do tomorrow. You're going to turn to a heading of 310 degrees. You're going to move 1.2 meters. You're going to swivel your camera 5 degrees. You're going to extend the probe 1.2 centimeters. Stop. Okay. And so it might end up being, 50 or 100 lines of scripted code, and then the vehicle will do that. It'll stop, and that's what it goes for that day, right? So it's all very, very carefully choreographed. It's like a puppeteer, right? That's not what these things are doing. And so Sunfish is the latest version of this disconnected AI controlled vehicle. So instead of choreographing, what we do is we build behaviors that respond to sensor-based data from the environment. And so a lot of the sensor data comes from sonar. We build three-dimensional maps around the vehicle. We build chemical maps around the vehicle. We can do a lot of other things as well, but those are two of the really important ones. And so with a 3D map, you can then process data and then make decisions about where you want to go. For example, if you're in a cave, you want to try to explore. You want to get as much new information as possible before you run out of battery power. And so it'll say, okay, I've examined this, I've analyzed this, there's more space I can move over there. And then it's going to look and say, am I going to hit anything along the way? And if it does, it alters its course so that it stays at some minimum keep out zone, so it's not going to get stuck or anything like that. And meanwhile, it's looking at things like what's my depth, what's my battery power, things of that nature. Am I going to run into anything ahead of me? Meanwhile, it says, do I have any macro goals? Well, we might say try to get as far north as you can. Only go into really big tunnels, but remember the ones that you didn't go into. And if you didn't get any, if the big one ends, come back and check that next one, right? That's not scripting. That's saying here's an idea, right? This is what a human would do, right? You go out and you go, okay, there's the big tunnel. I'm going down the big tunnel, and suddenly it ends. You go, well, why did it end? You spend a little time there looking. You're taking pictures. You're mapping. There's a really nice little video that the KUR Karst Underwater Research guys just put out. I'll send you a link when we get off here of where we are with this right now. So Sunfish will go into a subterranean chamber. It'll map it in 3D. And then it'll parse that chamber into photogrammetric imaging slices. And it'll go in there and it'll image with a machine vision camera and a series of strobes. And then it'll stitch all of that imagery on top of the geometry to the point where it becomes reality. And so then we can, for example, replay what it did, and you look at it and go, oh, wow, that's real. This is what the walls look like. Whereas if you were a cave diver, all you would see was, maybe there's a wall over there, or maybe you don't see it because it's too far away. And now you have this ability to do, a serious virtual reality immersion into it. Maybe this is good timing with this announcement from Apple, of this new VR headset that they've got. It's the kind of data that you could really powerfully fly into and examine. So I think it's a kind of a new scientific tool for underwater work. And so it doesn't just work in caves, it works in things like coral reefs. And so this is where Powell came in. He said, what if you had this thing follow me? And then if I give a series of hand gestures, you do what I want you to do. I want you to go over here and build a fine map of this area where I point to on this coral reef. And then if I do a different gesture, I want you to go in and take close-up photographs of that. Or if I do a different gesture, I want you to follow that fish and see if you can get a really good picture of it. He's kind of laid the gauntlet down and challenged us to see if we can outdo him at fish collection. And so that's going to be a big reach. And we'll see how far we get. It all depends on how much funding we can muster behind the project. But that's what Guardian and Copus are all about, is basically giving Rich a safety bot. And the other thing is that, and we've tested this, by the way, it can give, Rich can give it a gesture or communicate. We're working on digital data links and stuff like that, and say, I'm in trouble, get me home, and clip onto it and have it tow him back without him knowing where he is, and take him back to a geographical coordinate or take him back to a homing beacon on a boat. So it's kind of like an intelligent DPV, in the recovery mode. So that stuff's coming down the line. It's a long-term project, and we've got some other exciting stuff with him that I can't talk about yet. But when it happens, you'll probably hear about it in the news.
I cannot wait to hear about that, because it's really amazing to hear about all of this stuff, just because I mean, you guys are really pushing on the forefront there. So I just have one more question and then I'll let you go. I know you're super busy. You are speaking to your younger self. You're the guy poking you on the chest in your dormitory. What advice would you give to your younger self? Any final, good, don't do this, don't do that, slow down, speed up?
The biggest piece of advice, it would be, don't be so stressed about trying something crazy. To me, that was always the initial hang-up, was the risk, reward assessment, and the fear that you're going to spend, whatever, a year of your life, or, your entire savings and bank account on some crazy ass idea that won't work. I think it's to say, look, if there is an issue and you think that you've got a way forward, try it. You only get one run through life, and so is it worth spending your entire bank account to try a crazy ass idea that might radically change your ability to explore? Hell yeah. And I did it. much to the chagrin of my first wife, but yeah, it's if I had to say one thing, it would be go for it. Don't look back. Don't ever count the change, because the privilege of doing something new is worth it. There's I way back in 1979, I was at a conference, and at the end of it, a guy came up who turned out to be the president of the Explorers Club in New York, fairly august organization going all the way back to, Cook and Perry and, all those people back in like 1907 or whenever it was founded. And he said, would you like to be a member of the club, because we only pick people who do real stuff? And he said, it's obvious, you guys are doing it. And I said, sure. I got to know him really well. His name was Russ Gurney. He was one of the most knowledgeable guys. Every once in a while you run into somebody who's a real leader, and has experience worth listening to. And at one point he taught me all about Glenlivet Scotch and its merits on an island in the Caribbean while we were mapping a cave for a government down there for a national park. And he said, I forget exactly how I got on this topic. It was something about, it is so hard to raise money for expeditions that basically I empty my bank account to go on a project. And he stared at me and he said, no true explorer ever died rich. Well, Russ, you nailed that one. But you know what?
Oh, that's great.
I would not trade 1 second of the time I've spent on expeditions. And this is a funny thing too. As people who have been in this business, will probably tell you, I've got a lot of dead friends. The thing that you have to think about is, what is it that you don't want to do? And the thing you don't want to do is fixate on a goal or a record, because that's when you start cutting corners. And everybody I know, who is not here anymore was, in some ways, despite them being incredibly impressive people and great friends, they fell into that problem of fixating on doing something. What I can say is, when I look back on all the expeditions I've done, the thing that I remember most, and the thing that makes me want to keep doing it, is the privilege of being in an incredibly remote, dangerous place with an exceptionally talented small group of people. Those are the people you will remember for the rest of your life. And that is really the prize that comes out of an expedition. Yeah, okay, yeah, we get a lot of data and knowledge, and it's exciting to play the puzzle out, But am I fixated on Cheve being the world's deepest cave? No, the press loves that line, but that's really not why we go. We go because we want to play out the puzzle, right? We want to put the pieces together and watch it come together. And in the process of doing that, we do a lot of things that are uncomfortable. I can tell you this past spring we spent 2 months down there exploring a cave that is now 735 meters deep, and the average cross section of that place is less than the cubby hole under your desk, and it's got about a centimeter of gooey mud on the wall, ceilings, and floor. and there's very few places to sleep, so you're sleeping in a hammock slung over a tiny trickle of a river, in a place where if you lean left, you hit the muddy wall, and if you lean right, the muddy wall, and then you get up in the morning and go, okay, this is day 17. Let's have some fun. But in the end, you come back and you've got this data and you go, oh my God, look how this played out in this puzzle. Even though in my diary I'm writing, WTF am I doing in this hellhole? As soon as I saw the data, it was like, OMG, let's start planning the next expedition because this is going to be a big one. So, it's moments like that really make it for me, and it's the people I meet. My best friends are people that I've done important expeditions with, and some of them I've known for, good gosh, 50 years. Other ones, are new. To me, part of the reason that I'm still active and still doing this is because a lot of my friends are in that demographic that still has the drive, the spunk, the esprit de corps, and the athletic fitness to do this stuff, and they've got that spark of people who are doing it for the first time or recent. They're exciting and they're excited, and that rubs off, keeps me stoked. So, a lot of my friends are, 40, 45, 50 years younger than me. And as a result, in order to keep up with them and not have them dust my ass underground, I work out an hour and a half every day and start the heavier training about 6 weeks before an expedition. And then an expedition will kick your ass, you will not find a sport. There is no sport that is harder than deep vertical caving. Not the Tour de France, not any sport that's in the Olympics. It don't even come close. We burn 7,000 calories a day, and we do it for 30 days straight on a push, and then we'll come back, we'll spend a couple days recovering on the surface, and then go back and do it again. I lost 28 pounds this past spring in 2 months. You try not to. We try to engineer food to keep it on, but in the end, you burn off all your fat, and then if you're running too hot, you end up burning all your protein, which is bad because your heart happens to be a muscle too. So that's another facet of being on the frontier is trying to come up with food that works to keep you working as a biological mechanism. So we're veering pretty far from diving here, aren't we?
This is the stuff that I want to hear. Like, this has absolutely been amazing. And the only reason why I was ending it was just because, like, I literally could talk all day, but I know you're super busy and I don't want to take up a huge amount of your time. And honestly, if you ever want to come back on the podcast, just, if you have time, I know you're super busy, but it would be amazing to have recurring guests, especially you. I mean, there's quite a few stories because I would love to go in depth on certain stories, but I was trying to just, if in case this is the only time, get like a general story of the man. So this has been an amazing
All right,
experience.
Well, we can consider that in the future, and stay in touch.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. Offgassing, a scuba podcast.